After the Civil War, as the South begins to rebuild, life starts to change for all people in all aspects. We will look at what life was like after the war, how the Freedmen's Bureau was created, and then the labor systems in this PowerPoint. Life after the war was pretty devastating for most of the people involved. Millionaires were now in poverty. Businessmen had pretty much lost everything they had worked for. Some women, or Southern belles, were forced to work in support of themselves and their family. Society had become unstable because the government had created military districts instead of actual state governments. Everybody was focused more on surviving instead of actually having luxuries. And newly freed men started to exercise their rights as citizens. Now, life after the war for freedmen consisted of a number of different new abilities that they had. First was they could have religious ceremonies without any white influence. They could buy guns. They could be rude to whites, where before they had to be careful what they said, especially in public. They could change their name, look for relatives, family, or friends that they had lost during the slavery time period. Some of them would even travel hundreds of miles to find their wives, their husbands, or their children, mothers, fathers, any family member that might have been sold off to other plantations. A lot of freedmen actually started migrating out of the South looking for a better life, looking for jobs where they could get paid and jobs that gave them a future. Now, if you could imagine going from a life of being told what to do every day to a life where now all of a sudden you have a lot of freedoms compared to before, how that might even create some instability for you and your family. The federal government stepped in with what was called the Freedmen's Bureau to help freedmen in this new journey of establishing a life for themselves. The Freedmen's Bureau was created on March 3rd, 1865. It was designed to help freedmen and poor whites after the war was over. They would help you obtain food, shelter, and clothing. They would help you find a job and negotiate employment with either landowners. They created schools to educate those in the South, and as we talked about before, education was not a priority. However, with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau, it was starting to become a priority in the southern states. They designed ways to help protect all these new freedoms for freedmen and poor whites. You'll see in just a little bit when we talk about labor systems how even though slavery was over, they still tried to recreate that type of labor. The last aspect of what life was like is what labor was going to be like in the South, and especially in Georgia, after the war's over. When the war ends, any freedman was given 30 acres and a mule. Even though this land was passed out, whites still held the majority of land across the state of Georgia. Along the coast, after Sherman had taken over Savannah, he basically gave most of the land he had conquered to freedmen. However, it was eventually returned to white owners when President Johnson pardoned all of the white men who participated in the war. Proposals were made to give land to freedmen, however, none of these actually passed Congress. Eventually, what this causes is for those freedmen who did not have the money to leave the state, they had to return to some of the same plantations they were a slave at and ask for work.
There were four primary types of labor systems that sought to fill the void when slavery ended. Large landowners needed someone to continue to work their land, and they tried different ways to figure out how to fill that void. The gang labor system was one. It was a definite attempt at trying to recreate slavery. Gangs of workers would be put to work under one white overseer. Workers could be fined for not working hard enough. There was punishment, which could include being whipped for not obeying the orders of the overseer. It was too much like slavery, and freedmen preferred to pick their own supervisors. The wage labor system was created. Landowners wanted to pay workers cash, but had little money on hand after the war. Workers agreed to be paid when crops were harvested. Standing wages were paid after the harvest, and shared wages were paid with part of the harvest. So a worker could agree to be paid in cash after the harvest came in, or to be paid with part of the harvest to provide for their family. Contract systems. Workers would sign a one-year contract agreeing to work for the landowner. It created problems for the landowners themselves. Did not guarantee that they would have labor every year. If a worker became discontented, they just simply did not sign a contract the next year. Landowners began to feel that this method was much too costly in negotiating contracts. If landowners became abusive or unfair to the workers, they simply didn't sign a new contract and wouldn't return. Freedmen did not like the system. The landowners often cheated them or tried to treat them like slaves. And finally, the most common method was sharecropping or tenant farming. Laborers were contracted to work the land for the landowner. Landowners decided what to plant. Sharecroppers received a portion of the harvest, and landowners provided seeds, farm tools, food, and often a place to live for the tenant farmers, oftentimes on credit, creating a debt. This debt cycle, which we'll illustrate, kept the workers indebted to the landowners forever, basically creating a financial slavery for them. In this cycle, the first step would be the sharecropper being provided land and seed in exchange that he would promise the landowner half the crop. That meant that he would need tools, a place to live, food, and clothing for his family, which oftentimes would be provided by the landowner at his store. The sharecropper would plant and harvest the crops as promised. The sharecropper would then give the landowner the crop to sell. The sharecropper will get half the earnings minus the cost of his purchases, the home, the clothing, the food, and supplies needed to provide for his family. When settling up, the landowner says that the sharecropper owes more than he earned. Sometimes this happened by the landowner not being honest with the amount of money he made on the crop. Sometimes he just overcharged for the home, the clothing, or the food that were being supplied from the landowner's store. To pay the debt, the sharecropper must promise the landowner a greater share of next year's crop, beginning the cycle over again when they're provided seed and they continue to live in the home and they get more supplies. Eventually, the sharecropper finds themselves indebted to the landowner basically forever, never being able to break this cycle and being held in a financial slavery with no choice to move on or find another place to farm because they're not able to pay back their debts.